Recent research suggests that anxiety shows up differently in women's brains than it does in men's brains. These differences give us a window into how each of us responds to the anxiety we are all experiencing. Now, please remember, I'm talking generalities here. Our brains all have lots of things in common, but in the end, everyone's brain is unique, just the way we are all unique human beings. No two of us are the same, and no two brains are the same. And as with all gender differences, no one has the answers. No one way of thinking or no one brain is better or worse than the other. Our differences make us human and special and unique. And I love that we are different, and I celebrate our differences. Yay. So let's take a look at some of the differences I'm talking about. And let's do that by looking at Rose and Dan. Rose and Dan had been married for about 16 years, but lately things had gone south in the marriage, and they'd just been going through the motions. The day Dan brings up the subject of divorce, they agreed to go see a therapist in a last-ditch attempt to save what was left of their marriage. So, here we are in a session with the therapist where they are at work to save their marriage. After the therapist and Rose and Dan sit down together, the therapist asks them to start by telling each other what they like about each other and what they appreciate in the marriage. Well, the couple struggle to come up with a few things. They're really having trouble finding a way to compliment each other. But when the therapist asks them to share some of their concerns and complaints, they do not hold back. Rose jumps right in and says, Dan won't fight with me. When he gets angry, he clams up and walks away, and that makes me crazy. How can we settle anything if we're not talking? Bottom line, we do not communicate effectively. Not to be outdone, Dan comes right back at her saying, I'd say Rose communicates enough for both of us. She never lets anything go. Every time we fight, she brings up the things I did 10 years ago. She has this never-ending list of the bad things Dan has done, and she runs through it every single time I do something that ticks her off. She will not let it go, and that makes me crazy. All right. The therapist held up her hands to signal a pause in the action. Let's all take a breath and sum up what you've both said here. From what I'm hearing, it sounds to me like you both react differently to conflict. It sounds to me like you're almost speaking a different language. And that may be because in general, women's and men's brains tend to react differently to stress and conflict. And that may be because we're wired differently. The therapist motioned to Dan. For years, we believed that all human reaction to stress was either fight or flight. But recent research is proving that fight or flight response is the male reaction to danger or conflict. In the male brain, the circuit of aggression, that feeling of being threatened or in danger, that's the circuit of aggression, is connected to areas in the brain that are linked to physical action. What does that mean? It means when threatened, males tend to respond to that stress by acting, by doing, by standing, by fighting, by running, by fleeing. Again, it's fight or flight. The therapist turned to Rose. But what we've learned recently is that in the female brains, that circuit of aggression, that circuit of fear isn't connected to the action response. It's connected to the areas of the brain for thinking, feeling, and talking. So what I'm saying is our brains are wired differently. And we've learned from our research that the female's response to danger or conflict is what we're now calling tend and befriend. It's not about action. It's about connection. The female's response to danger tends to be bonding, connecting, communicating, reaching out to others. So when challenged, the female brain says, go, talk it out. At the same time, the male brain is saying, don't talk, do something, or just disengage entirely. Do you see the difference? Rose and Dan looked at each other and Rose said, boy, that sounds a lot like us. Dan nodded in agreement. You're right. When I'm stressed, all I want to do is avoid everyone else on this planet. And I have never been able to figure out why Rose didn't want to avoid me too. He smiled at Rose. But hearing that we're wired differently and hearing that Rose is more concerned about connecting helps me understand where she's coming from. We really do respond differently. Rose smiled back. And the therapist continued, the differences in your brains don't stop there. It turns out women and men remember things differently. Research shows that in women, there tends to be more blood flow to the parts of the brain that process emotions and then relates those emotions to events. This causes women to revisit, to ruminate, to go over and over and over and over and over emotional memories, much more than men. Women are more likely to remember the past in greater detail. I like to think of it this way. It's as if women are watching the past as if it's a full-length Technicolor surround sound feature movie, and they watch it over and over and over. On the other hand, the therapist turned to Dan. Memories in men tend to be short and sweet. The way they remember is more like a movie trailer, not that full-length feature movie. They think briefly about a memory, they may analyze it, and then they move on to something active and unrelated to those feelings. So take a minute and think about those differences in how we remember. On one hand, we have that full-length feature movie, Technicolor. On the other hand, we have the trailer. Can you see how those differences might be showing up in your relationship? Dan laughed and nodded, and then he looked at Rose as if he was beginning to see her in a completely different light. So that's why she keeps harping on something long after it makes any sense to bring it up. She won't let it go. And he looked back at the therapist and said, I bet the way she thinks about things over and over is part of what makes her so anxious. Rose sat up and nodded. You're right, Dan. I do keep thinking the same thoughts again and again, and I can feel in my body how that makes me more anxious. Dan and Rose looked at each other as if they were truly beginning to see each other in a new light. Dan looked to the therapist and said, so how else are our brains different? Great question, the therapist said. we know that anxiety just looks a little different in our brains. Brain scans show us that the female brains are more active in terms of blood flow to the part of the brain that helps with focus and impulse control, the emotional part of the brain. It's called the limbic brain. It's in the middle part of our brain. And it's the part that handles mood and anxiety. So women have more blood flow to this part of our brain. Women's brains are more active. And when you think about that and you look at the brain scans and how active this area is, it may explain why women worry more than men and why their worry response, the response to worry, is longer and stronger. Huh, said Rose. How else are we different? The therapist shook her head in many ways. And, we don't know a lot about the differences in our brain. We are just beginning to do research into gender differences in our brain and what role, if any, they play in anxiety in both men and women. It's a brand new science. Just getting to start to look at the differences. The therapist leaned back. But for now, I hope that talking about the differences and how your brains work has helped you to begin to understand each other and where you're coming from. Dan glanced at Rose. It has been a big help for me. I really do see how we are different. And Rose smiled back and said, this has given me some hope that if we can understand these differences, we can find ways to work together. And maybe knowing something more about how anxiety works in my brain will help me better understand why I'm so anxious all the time. The therapist nodded. Talking about the brain is such a great place to start the discussion about relationships and what causes our anxiety. She smiled at both her clients. I think we are off to a really positive start here. I have such hope that over the next few weeks, we can work together to find some really great tools and techniques to help you both learn about each other, to relax, and to begin to heal this relationship. So I think we are off to a great start here, you and I. Now, as we wrap up with Rose and Dan, let me say to you exactly what the therapist said to them. I think we are off to a great start here, you and I. So excited that we're working together. But let me just add, and this is a critical aside, I'm talking about women here. I'm talking about women's anxiety. But men are anxious too. I understand. I truly understand that men have anxiety. And I know how miserable dealing with anxiety can be for anyone. And let me say, I believe we all deserve to feel better. You, me, all of us. And so this course, this module, this is for all of us. And let me just say, if you find this is working for you, I hope you'll share it with your anxious friends and family, anyone in your life who's dealing with anxiety. Please, please, please let them know there is help and there is hope here for all of us. This is about doing it together. All of us. Let's agree. No more suffering. So, that wraps it up for this module. In the next module, we're going to talk more about the causes of anxiety, what's making us anxious, and what's making you anxious in particular. Because the more we know about our anxiety, the better we're going to be able to deal with it. And that's what this is all about, healing our anxiety. Now, if you're ready to jump right into the next module, great. Can't wait to see you there. But as with all these modules, it's perfectly okay to just listen to one at a time. And then Sit with what you've learned for a while. Just absorb and digest a new perspective or maybe a new way of thinking about your anxiety. Take your time, go at your own pace. And of course, you can always return to a module anytime you feel a need for a refresher or a reminder. I'm here for you. Let's take our time with this. We'll go at your pace. Together, you and I are going to figure out ways to help you feel better, to help you ease those fears and start living that anxiety-free life you were born to live.